Okay, hello, good evening. I'm Luke Harding. Thanks, Helena. Very good to open 5 by 15 this evening. When I was here 2 years ago, I was talking about the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, who, as you will recall, was killed in 2006 with a radioactive cup of tea. It was an extraordinary story. My role in it was also a bit strange. I flew to Moscow on one of the planes contaminated with radioactive polonium. Litvinenko died that November, and about 2 weeks afterwards, I got a letter from British Airways saying, "Dear Mr. Harding, we regret to inform you that the plane you traveled on was contaminated with polonium." And then it said, "If you have any concerns, ring NHS Direct." So I called NHS Direct, and I was in that kind of phone hell with dial 1 for chest pains, 2 for breathing difficulties. And I thought, well, firstly, I thought there's not going to be a dial 127 if you've been on a plane carrying a deadly isotope as part of a Cold War style plot. And I also thought that this story, which was the basis of a book I wrote, A Very Expensive Poison, would never be repeated. And just quickly to reprise that, what we found in 2016, there was a public inquiry which told us that this was indeed an operation plotted and executed by the FSB, the spy agency that Vladimir Putin headed before he became prime minister and president, and that Putin himself had probably approved the operation. So I was wrong. If we go to March of this year, March of 2018, we had an astonishing story on a similar scale to Litvinenko, featuring Sergei Skripal on the left and Yulia Skripal, his daughter, on the right. Now, Sergei Skripal, unlike Alexander Litvinenko, was, they were both intelligence operatives, but he was swapped out of Russia, having been jailed for espionage for working with British intelligence. Unlike Litvinenko, who was a kind of outspoken and public critic of Putin's, Skripal led a kind of modest, almost dull life in provincial Salisbury. Of course, as you know, he was found comatose on a bench with his daughter one Sunday afternoon, and it turned out that, according to the British government, he'd been poisoned with Novichok, a kind of lethal, super deadly toxin developed in secret facilities in the late Soviet Union in the 1990s. So we had this story again. We had sort of scenes of kind of incongruous horror in the shopping center, and guys in hazmat suits running around. And most of all, we had an accusation from the British government to Moscow that Putin was again responsible. And I think I would just say briefly that I find the British government's case persuasive. I think only Putin's Russia would have the motive to do this, to try and whack a former intelligence officer who, anybody who betrays the Russian state and collaborates with Western intelligence is regarded as a traitor. That's the motive. And the means, I think, were pretty demonstrative, despite official denials from Moscow. I think, actually, that Skripal, although he was obviously the target, was essentially the instrument. And I think the wider target was Britain. I think Britain at the moment is Vladimir Putin's least favorite country. But I also think the message was sent to the Russian elite, and in particular, anybody from the spy agencies who is thinking of collaborating with the West, and in particular with Western intelligence. And lastly, I would say the Skripal poisoning was a message to this man. How many people here know who this is? Do we all know? Oh, okay. Well, this is Christopher Steele, the author of the Steele dossier, who connects all of these things together. He was when he was working for MI6, he investigated Litvinenko's murder and kind of concluded this was a state-run assassination. And additionally, he, of course, authored the Trump dossier, which set off the kind of huge scandal which continues to sort of rage in Washington. In my book, Collusion, the kind of prologue opens with my meeting Christopher Steele in December 2016. And he's been portrayed by Trump's kind of Republican allies as a sort of left-wing agitator, polemicist. And actually, he's nothing of the kind. I went to see him with a colleague at his office in Victoria, just round the corner from Buckingham Palace and the Queen's back garden, and we went inside his private business consultancy, Orbis. There was a kind of map of the world on the wall, and inside his kind of director's office were a series of nesting dolls of great 19th century Russian writers, Tolstoy, Pushkin, Lermontov, and so on. And it sort of seemed to me that this was the kind of almost the sort of best metaphor for what he was doing secretly at this stage, which was to try and unnestle this story, extraordinary story of how the Kremlin tried to basically fix the 2016 election for Donald Trump. And so we had a cup of tea in the Shakespeare pub just around the corner from his office. Steele, like the former spy he was, didn't say a huge amount. He was rather reticent. We talked about our investigation into Trump and how all investigative journalists at this point were trying to answer a fairly simple question, which was, how is it that Donald Trump is so polite and nice and sort of kissy about Vladimir Putin when he's so abominably rude about everyone else on the planet? And this sort of strange fealty from Trump to Putin, which we saw when he was a candidate, which we saw when he was president-elect, and which we still see even today. I was watching this morning James Comey's interview with ABC News and George Stephanopoulos, where Comey was saying, among other things, apart from likening Trump to a mafia boss, was saying that even in private, Trump refuses to criticize Vladimir Putin. So something strange was going on. And Steele, he said nothing about his dossier. He merely intimated that we should follow the money in classic Watergate fashion, and also follow the sex. Now I've done a lot of investigations, but I'm not quite sure how one follows the sex as a journalist, but that was the message. And then, of course, his dossier came out in January of last year, essentially saying that Trump was compromised, that Putin had leverage over him, and that Putin had been assisting him for at least 5 years before the presidential election. And so my book, Collusion, is an attempt to kind of wrap all this together, to tell the story of Donald Trump and Russia, and also to go back to the Cold War, because I think to understand what happened and what's happening in our chaotic 21st century world, we need to look at Cold War methods and KGB methods, and in particular a trip that Donald Trump made in the summer of 1987 to Soviet Moscow. These are the two besties together, but there he is. That's a kind of slightly younger looking Donald Trump. On the left is Ivana, his then wife. That's them in Leningrad. And essentially, one of the things I discovered when I was researching this story was that Trump was essentially brought over to Moscow in the late 1980s by the KGB. Now, that sounds a bold claim, but essentially his transport was arranged by Intourist, which essentially was the KGB, the sort of official state travel agency. Someone called Yuri Dubinin, who was the then Soviet ambassador to Washington, arrived fresh off the plane from Moscow at the beginning of his posting. And the first thing he did was to go to Trump Tower, take the elevator up, and knock on the door, introduce himself to Trump and say, Mr. Trump, you are a visionary. You have made the most beautiful building in America. We, the Soviet Union, admire you. Now, that sounds fairly innocuous, but what you have to understand is there's a kind of backstory to this of essentially the KGB during this period in the 1980s, the head, someone called Vladimir Khrushchev, complaining that the KGB was doing too little against the main enemy being America, and that it needed to recruit more Americans. And what Khrushchev did in a series of top secret memos, which he circulated around his sort of KGB heads of station in London and Washington and Paris, was send a personality questionnaire of the kind of people that the KGB was interested in cultivating. And there was a list. It was quite a long document. And they were looking for people who were vain, narcissistic, unfaithful to their wives, without scruple and deeply interested in money, and poor analysts. And you go down this list, and there's one candidate who emerges very strongly from this kind of selection process. And of course, it's Donald Trump. And bear in mind that he'd already married someone from behind the Iron Curtain. He had a father-in-law still living in communist Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakian spies had kept an eye on the Trumps in Manhattan. And so Trump goes to Moscow. He talks about building a hotel there, which never comes off. And there's a curious kind of epilogue to this trip, which is that about 4 weeks after he returns from the Soviet Union, he takes out 3 full-page adverts in high-profile American newspapers criticizing Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. And he also lets it be known that he is thinking of a new career. He is thinking about entering politics, and he is thinking about becoming president of the United States. This is already in the summer of 1987. So this is not to say that Donald Trump is a full KGB colonel. What it is, although the image is quite arresting if you imagine the uniform and the medals and the Brezhnevian eyebrows, but more that the Soviet Union and Russia have a kind of interest in him. And this, I think, was rebooted about sort of 2011, 2012, 2013, when, of course, Donald Trump flew to Moscow for the Miss Universe beauty pageant, and according to the Trump dossier, had let's say, a pretty exotic time in the penthouse suite of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. And James Comey was talking about this too yesterday. And I think what we can say is we don't know whether Donald Trump watched a show that evening. But what I can tell you from my own rather kind of bittersweet experience is that the KGB successor, the FSB, has a long history of trying to seduce high-profile targets from the West, Americans, British diplomats, and so on, that it used to have a special department where it would send young women to try and... I talked to one former British intelligence officer who told me he was traveling on the Trans-Siberian Railway, and a bit like From Russia with Love, a woman came in, very young, wearing a diaphanous blouse, saying, I would like to practice my English. So these tactics are very old. When I was in Moscow, the FSB, Putin's former spy agency, broke repeatedly into the flat where I was living with my wife and our 2 small kids. They were unhappy about the articles I was writing about the Litvinenko case, about the murder of political dissidents and opponents of the Putin regime. And we were bugged. And also we were told by the British Embassy that the FSB had planted video, including in our bedroom, so they saw everything. On one occasion, they even left a sex manual by the side of the bed in Russian, next to the kind of middle-class novels that I'm sure you all read in English. And they had bookmarked it to a page on orgasms, page 147. And I was looking at this thinking, what message are the KGB trying to tell me? Is there a frequency issue? Is there a technical problem that they've detected when they were kind of pressing wind and rewind? Is it that we're just too conservative for their perhaps more adventurous tastes? I don't know. But I can tell you from personal experience that this is what they do. So there will be a tape of Donald Trump in Moscow. I'm told there are multiple tapes. No one tweet this because it's unverified, but I'm also told that other Eastern Bloc agencies have tapes, and Vladimir Putin will know what's on the tape, and Donald Trump will know what's on the tape. And I think, there's clearly more to come in this story. We have a series of indictments. We had a raid 10 days ago on the offices and home of Michael Cohen, Trump's personal lawyer, who also features in the Steele dossier. And my view is that the flames are now in the White House garden. I mean, they haven't come into the Oval Office yet, but when Trump looks out, he can see orange. I mean, the orange man can see orange, it kind of engulfing him. And I think the Mueller investigation is probably mortal for Trump in some form, which is not to say that he'll be impeached, but he's clearly the most scandalous president that anyone can remember. And what's going on now is not normal. It really is not normal. This is not normal times that we live in. And I would just say, by way of closing, that other investigative journalists, people from what you might call the Fourth Estate, we have been investigating this story furiously for a long period. It's been difficult. We operate in a cacophonous world where the president, where Putin, where all of their kind of agencies and supporters pump out disinformation, dismiss all criticism as fake news, and say that what we produce is rubbish. Well, it's not rubbish. It is true. As soon as we verify, we publish as true as we can make it. And I would just lastly sort of urge you to support us, to buy The Guardian if you don't like The Guardian, buy The Telegraph if you don't like The Telegraph, buy something else, but kind of come into this kind of civic space with us. We need a kind of another enlightenment. We need good method. We need empiricism. We need rationality. And I would say, let's try and be in this space. And if we can kind of love each other as well and have a good evening this evening, then great, and thank you.